On St. Patrick's Day back in 2013, the New York Times had an article written by Bruce Feller that was titled, "Our Life, the Stories That Bind Us." I believe the article actually was probably an excerpt from his book, but the thing that most people remembered about the story was that it had a diagnostic scale that was called the Do You Know scale. It was really a scale that would help to see and measure how well families actually know each other. It was aimed primarily at children to find out what information they knew about their parents and their grandparents that they could not have learned firsthand. Couldn't have been an experience that they shared with their family, but what is something they learned through a story or through reading an article or some other source. Now, the scale was 20 questions, which may sound like a lot, but it's really not that much. So I'm going to give you the test right now, but I'm going to give it quick. So you got to listen quick, okay? And just so you know, my score was 15 out of 20 that I knew. So the first question is, do you know when your grandparents met? Do you know where your grandparents were married? Do you know where your mother grew up? Do you know where your father grew up? Do you know where your parents met? Do you know where your parents got married? Do you know what was going on in the world when you were being born? I like how people are looking at each other while I'm asking these questions. Do you know why you are named what you are named? Do you know some things that were going on in the world when your brothers and or your sisters were being born? Do you know which person in your family you look like the most? Do you know which person in your family you act like the most? Do you know some of the illnesses and injuries that your parents experienced when they were young? Do you know some of the lessons that your parents learned either through good or bad experiences? Do you know some of the things that happened to your parents when they were going to school? Do you know what awards and recognition your parents received? Do you know the national background of your family? You know, like, are you Italian, African, Australian? Do you know the national background of your family? Do you know the jobs your parents had when they were young? Do you know what happened to your mom and dad when they went to school? Do you know where your mom went to school? Do you know where your dad went to school? Do you know about a relative whose face froze in a grumpy position because he or she did not smile enough? Those are the questions of the do you know scale. And the idea is that the more families communicate and the more that you know about your family, the stronger your family is. But one of the things that they discovered is that families did not always agree on the answers. In other words, your mom may say, well, this is how it happened, and your dad said, no, this is how I remembering it happened. And so if your family does not agree on everything, how does that affect the story that binds your family together? I mean, if your grandmother says the origin of our family is English and your father says the origin of our family is Dutch, what does that do to your story? Because when we think about the stories that bind us together, we know that those stories will be tested, they will be challenged, they will be stressed, but somehow, even though they may bend, hopefully they never break. Because this is also the same thing that applies to the story of our faith. Just consider the gospel writers as they began to talk and write about Jesus. When we read the gospels, we see that they don't all tell the same story exactly the same way, and yet we still believe the story. And the story, as it has been passed down from generation to generation, starting with the apostles all the way to our lives today, over thousands of years of history, through hundreds of generations, We believe that this story has been tested, it has been scorned, it has been accepted, it has been rejected. This story sometimes has been in need of reform in how the story is told. We know that it has withstood scandal, fightings outside, as well as fighting within, which is why in 1749, Charles Wesley penned the question of a lyric, "Are we yet alive?" The story of our faith, understood differently, but an important thing that binds us together. Actually, when we look at the history of the early church, we see that this is just one part of the things that bind us together. In the early church, when you read the book of Acts, there were three ingredients, three characteristics, whatever words you want to use, that bonded early believers together. And these three characteristics were charisma, diakonia, and koinonia. How you like them words? Yeah. Now, I know what y'all are thinking. 3 words, 3 points to the sermon. No. 3 sermons. 3 sermons. Today we're going to look at charisma. Charisma is actually, all of these are Greek words. And charisma is the Greek word that means to proclaim or proclamation. And what we discover in the early church is that the apostles proclaim what they believe. They don't have a Bible to guide them. They are proclaiming good news, new news. And when it came to their proclamation, essentially there were 3 things that they talked about, although sometimes you might say that they talked about 4. The 3 things were, Jesus was born, Jesus died, Jesus rose again. Now, sometimes they did add, and Jesus is coming back again. This is the charisma. This is the proclamation of the early church. But not everybody agrees with the story. Because we've been looking at what was going on in the book of Acts, and in chapter 4 we saw how Peter and John were faithful Jews. They believed Jesus was the Messiah, and now we have the 2 groups identified. On the one hand, we have traditional Jews who were still looking for the Messiah to come, but we also had Jews that believed Jesus was the Messiah. And there was an increasing number of Jews that believed this. And as they believed, the tension began to rise, such that whenever Peter and John are going to the temple to pray, and a man asks them for money, and he says, "We don't have any money, we'll give you what we have. All we have is Jesus. In the name of Jesus, rise and walk." And the man walks. He's been crippled his whole life. He's never walked, and now he's walking. The man goes into the temple, and everybody sees him. They recognize it. They say, "What's going on?" And so this is when Peter begins to say, Jesus was born, Jesus died, although he got a little personal and said, "And you killed him." And Jesus rose again. And therein is a hope that we have for salvation, is that in Jesus rising from the dead, we have the promise of the forgiveness of our sins. In fact, he wants to do more than merely forgive us. He wants to radically reorient our lives so that we will follow after him. And the Jewish leaders that were against that didn't know what to do. And so they threw him in jail overnight, and the next day they let him off with a warning. They get back, Peter and John, to where the community of faith is. The people said, "We were worried sick. You didn't come home last night. We didn't know what happened to you. Can you explain what happened?" And they told him what had happened. And it said that when they prayed, they began to pray for even more boldness. And this found favor, and God's response was dramatic, that the place where they were praying began to shake. And yet, friends, I want to submit to you, this is a prayer that is a prime example of you need to be careful what you ask for. Because they ask for more boldness, and the next day they go back to the temple, and again they're giving, Jesus was born, Jesus died, Jesus rose again. And this time they've really ticked off the Jewish leaders. This time the Jewish leaders are so furious they want to kill them. Let's read what happens when this is what's going on from Acts chapter 5. When they heard this, they being the Jews, when they heard this, they were furious and wanted to put them to death. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law who was honored by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered that the men be put outside for a little while. You've done that with your kids, right? You've wanted to figure something out, and you say, y'all go in the other room for a little while, and we'll call them back. That's kind of what's going on here. Put them outside for a little while. Verse 35. Then he addressed them. Men of Israel, consider carefully what you intend to do to these men. Some time ago, Theudas appeared, claiming to be somebody, and about 400 men rallied to him. He was killed, all his followers were dispersed, and it all came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean appeared in the days of the census and led a band of people in revolt. He too was killed, and all his followers were scattered. Therefore, in the present case, I advise you, leave these men alone. Let them go. For if their purpose or activity is of human origin, it will fail. But if it is from God, you will not be able to stop these men. You will only find yourselves fighting against God. His speech persuaded them. They called the apostles in and had them flogged. Then they ordered them not to speak in the name of Jesus and let them go. The apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day, in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Christ. Brothers and sisters, this is the word of the Lord. All right, now everybody take a deep breath. Hang on, we're going to get going here, all right? What they proclaim is that Jesus Christ is the Lord. This is the foundation of what they believed. This is the faith handed down to us through apostolic tradition over years of history. This is the faith that we believe. What we believe, we proclaim. But not everybody believes the story the same way. So I would suggest to you that one of the things that we must understand is it's not enough to believe the story. We must believe the right things about the story. Now, I want to illustrate this by telling you a story from two different perspectives, okay? This is not a story that you're going to find written down anywhere. This is just a story that I made up to illustrate the point. Are y'all okay with that? Okay, thank you, good. So here's the first part of the story. I want you to imagine a letter that was written from an army officer to a mother. The letter says, "Dear Mrs. Smith, I regret to inform you that your son John was killed during a conflict in the hills of northern Virginia. We know that John was fond of horses, and two of the horses that were in his possession were saved and returned. We thank you for his service to our country, and we pray for this war to end quickly. Sincerely, Colonel Jones." Okay, y'all got that story? Think you have an understanding of what that story means in your mind, okay? Not important that you all agree, but that's a story. Now here's how the story may have been reported in the newspaper. Yesterday, a Confederate soldier, John Smith, was killed in a conflict in the hills of northern Virginia. Smith was said to have deserted his unit 6 months ago in sympathy for the northern cause against the practice of the buying and selling of slaves in the South. He was found when a local rancher reported that a team of 5 horses had been stolen. He and his party were spotted when they were walking along a river. When they were told to surrender so the horses could be returned, some of his party bolted, but Smith chose to engage in gunfire. It was then that he was killed. 2 of the horses in his possession were returned to the owner. Okay, so what's the right thing to believe about the story? Because the Jews, on one hand, say that the Messiah is still coming. They do not deny that Jesus was born. They do not deny Jesus died. And in the speech for Gamaliel, I'm beginning to sense that maybe there's some question about the resurrection. We remember from reading the Gospels that the Jews wanted to silence any news about the resurrection. But here, as people are coming into the temple, the first thing they're doing is threatening them. Now they want to kill them. And this is when Gamaliel says, whoa, 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 whoa. Let's figure this out just a second. Let's put the kids in the other room and let's have the adults talk. Y'all remember Theudas? He came along saying the same kind of thing, and people thought he was the Messiah, and 400 men rallied around him, but when he was killed, they all scattered. And how about Judas the Galilean? You know, that's where Jesus was from Nazareth in Galilee. And so when Judas rose up and people followed him, as soon as he was killed, all his believers scattered. And this is where we begin to see that the Gamaliel's trying to figure this out. He said, because if this Jesus is like those other two, just let it rest. Jesus is dead. They're going to disperse. They're going to scatter. They're going to stop this nonsense. But if they're right, if Jesus really is the promised Messiah, if Jesus is the one sent from God, then if we fight against these men, then we're fighting against God. Let's just let them go. Got to believe the right things about the story. And in Gamaliel's mind, I think Gamaliel is uncertain about the resurrection. And he wants to make sure that he gets it right. For him, part of the evidence is if this proclamation stops, then we knew it was nothing. But the apostles didn't stop. Remember, they had us, we've got to proclaim that which we believe. That Jesus was born, Jesus died, Jesus rose again, and occasionally we throw in, and he's coming back. That's our charisma. That's what we believe. We don't agree on everything. Baptism. You Methodist. You recovering Presbyterians and Catholics and Lutherans. We're all okay with baptizing them babies, but I'm here to tell you, the recovering Baptists in our midst, former Pentecostals, they're willing to go along with it, but they don't believe it. We don't all believe the same thing about this. Some of us love it. Some of us put up with it. When we replaced the carpet in the church, we are not taking a poll about what color the carpet should be. Red. So, we don't agree on everything, and that's okay. The apostles, when they're proclaiming the good news, it becomes the foundation of our faith. They know they're going to have those moral questions and those other things that they have to deal with. That is not the identity of what we are. It helps explain some of why we do things, but who we are people who believe the story that Jesus suffered and died for us so that the whole world might be saved. Therefore, we ought to be people willing to be like Christ and suffer and die to tell that good news. The people that vandalized the church in Tulsa, they were caught. Video surveillance is a wonderful thing. And I bet they didn't look a thing like you expected. It was 2 teenage girls. Yeah, y'all didn't expect that, did you? They had come to our church when the Boy Scouts were meeting, and they had wandered around. They had messed up stuff in other places, but the library was the only place that they had done any damage. And so we contacted their parents and said, did you know your daughters did this? And of course, the parents were mortified. And we asked if we could just meet with their families and talk to them. And so when the girls came in, The older girl, I believe she was 15, you could tell she had some street sense about her. She said all the right things when apologizing, but she said them so well you didn't really know how sincere she was. And the other girl was mortified. She was afraid. I think probably her parents told her the reality that when you do damage like this in a church, it can be considered a hate crime. And so it was that we sat down with the girls and their parents and we said, look, we're not mad. We're not mad. We're not going to call the police. We're not going to file charges. We're not mad. We're hurt. If you intended to hurt us, mission accomplished, because that's what it did. It hurt us. But we're not mad. But when we've talked to your parents feel like there ought to be some discipline that helps you learn a lesson. And so we've talked about that. And here is what we're going to ask you to do because of what you have done. For the next 6 Sundays, we want you to be in church and worship with us. Now, y'all listen to me a lot. Y'all would agree, 6 weeks of my sermons is punishment. 6 weeks, we want you to be in church with us. And you're going to find out how messy Methodists are. Because after church, we're going to ask you to stick around and we're going to ask you to clean all the trash that people leave behind. Your parents agree to that. That's all we're going to ask you to do. At the end of 6 weeks, we're done. We're good. Let's move forward. At the end of 6 weeks, one of the families kept coming to church. And so it was that their daughter came up one day after church and said, you keep talking about how we need to follow Jesus. How can I do that? How can I give my life to him? Brothers and sisters, with grace, humility, and love for people, we must boldly and powerfully proclaim good news.